Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've seen the latest labour market data coming out for the end of 2023. We are still seeing that labour market weaken. We're seeing a little bit more spare capacity come through, but we're still a long way from sort of seeing a loose labour market. What do those latest numbers show?
Yeah, so we've got the unemployment rate, which is pushed up to 4%, and it's its highest level in 2.5 years. But like you say, it's not a loose labour market. It's sort of what we think about being kind of neutral, not going to generate more inflation, but it's also not going to create a sort of spare or indicating spare capacity across the economy either. Employment was up 0.4% for the quarter, so we are still seeing jobs growth. It's just that job growth is not keeping pace with the amount of population growth that we've got and the number of people coming into the country, of course, with net migration at record highs at the moment. And we would expect, given that job growth is not keeping pace, that net migration should probably start to ease, that employer demand for additional workers will taper off during 2024. Probably the other key with all of those numbers as well is that they were all on the, I guess, tighter side relative to expectations, both for financial markets and the Reserve Bank. So while people were expecting the labour market to ease, it hasn't eased by quite as much as we might have been anticipating.
That's true. I mean, like you say, the unemployment rate came in at 4.0. The market sort of pick was more that 4.1 to 4.3% range. So yes, it increased, but not by quite as much. You saw the likes of the underutilization rate rise as well. But sort of in a sense, looking through the numbers, everything rose, right? You sort of had employment up, you had the number of people up, you had the unemployment up. And I think that's probably quite different. When people are thinking about the unemployment rate increasing, they're often thinking about people losing jobs. We're actually not necessarily seeing that in the latest numbers. In fact, if you look through in the seasonally adjusted data, you had a 15,000 person increase in the in the labour force in the December quarter. Of those 15,000 people, most of that's through migration, of course. 12,000 of them got a job, 3,000 of them didn't. And that 3,000 person increase in the people who didn't get a job, they're now counted as unemployed. So it is one of those things where sort of everyone or every group is increasing, some more than others. Of course, the other thing that we're often watching quite closely is what's happening to wages, which had been increasing quite a bit. Of course, if you see that wage pressure remain too high for too long, you're risking inflation becoming more embedded because of how much that wage pressure might flow through to prices. What's the latest on that? Are we starting to get better returns, or is it getting even worse?
Well, going sideways, actually, the latest labour cost index numbers showed it was up 4.3% from a year ago, and it's stuck at around that level for the last 3 or 4 quarters now. Again, probably that result, the fact that it wasn't coming down, a little bit disappointing for both the Reserve Bank and financial markets, because like you say, there are risks there that if you're getting those cost pressures, those wage cost pressures continuing to come through for businesses, that it feeds through into more inflationary pressures persisting throughout 2024. However, when you delve into the numbers a little more closely, what was interesting was that private sector labour cost growth, that eased below 4%, and it's trended down over the last couple of quarters. So just signs that as that labour market is easing, you're not getting quite as much cost pressure coming through in the private sector. At the moment, that's been counterbalanced by bigger labour cost increases in the public sector. That was a function largely as a result of some major collective agreements that came through in the second half of 2023 for primary and secondary teachers, as well as pay equity for nurses. So there's some specific pressures there, as well as a bit of catch up in terms of public sector pay rates across some of the government departments as well, because there was a pay freeze in place due to COVID over the previous couple of years. We'd be hoping that some of those numbers start to fall out of it, and it does slow in terms of public sector going forward. But I guess the key nugget of good news in there is that private sector wage inflation is slowing, suggesting that the improving amount of sort of people or growing number of people available to work across the country is taking away some of that pressure on wages and the costs that are being faced by employers.
And that's the thing, right? When you look at some of those numbers, you look at the likes of the labour cost index broken down by industry, some of the largest annual gains over the last 12 months have been for, like you said, the health sector and education and training. So if you don't think those are necessarily going to be repeated, because they are, they were big settlements that the government had to look through and fund, then again, that sort of feeling of, is there a lot of sustained pressure, or was that sort of a one-off coming through, again, gives you a little bit more comfort. However, However, so we've had the unemployment rate up, but not as much as the Reserve Bank thought or the market thought. Wages sort of tracking sideways compared to a hope and an expectation that they would maybe fall away a little bit more. Where does that leave us with the Reserve Bank? I mean, you've had the likes of GDP coming in weaker, both weaker overall, but you look at the likes of inflation, also weaker, but perhaps a little bit stronger in a sense than some people might have been picking. The labour market, again, moving in the right direction, but maybe a little bit stronger than people were picking. What does that all shape up for the Reserve Bank in your mind? Are they sort of going to be sticking to their guns? Are they moving about? Are we starting to see any moves in either direction?
Yeah, look, in my view, there's not enough in the latest data, particularly from the labour market, to suggest the Reserve Bank needs to be raising interest rates again. But there has been an increasing amount of chatter over the last few days that potentially we could see, a rate rise at the end of this month and potentially another rate rise in the following quarter as well. So there is a bit of a shift there. We have seen, that's just some commentators, we have seen financial markets also just pushing out the timing of their expected rate cuts as well. And I think that is appropriate because financial markets had got well ahead of what the Reserve Bank had been indicating, and indeed what we ourselves were thinking around where interest rates go to from here. I guess the risk sitting around the Reserve Bank's monetary policy from here, as we have seen over the last, 2 to 3 years, several times where the Reserve Bank seems to have been quite backward looking in terms of some of their decision making, not necessarily reacting to the latest data. Now, typically when you're trying to set monetary policy, when you're watching the economic indicators, the labour market is the very last thing to turn, and wage inflation the last part of the labour market data to turn. And so the fact that it's not moderating as quickly as you might have liked, well, it still has moderated from where it was 6 or 9 months ago. It's moving in the right direction. Give it a bit of time. We know there's still a bit of an interest rate pain to come through for households yet. And I think that raising right at the last part of the sort of economic cycle, when everything seems to have turned, raising further now would be a mistake. But who knows? We'll find out in a couple of weeks' time.
Well, and that's one of the challenges, right? We know that the economy moves first and the likes of the labour market moves second. We might well find ourselves in a position where the economy moves first, the labour market second, and the Reserve Bank last of all. I mean, it's one of those, I think, big challenges looking forward as well, is that we are moving in a better direction. And, all of the indicators are showing that in terms of those inflationary pressures coming off and some of the things that might feed into those inflationary pressures also not as intense. But for the Reserve Bank, they're also sitting there probably fretting because they've got a job to do with getting inflation under control, and they seem to be sort of slower than everyone else, realizing that it hadn't got under control quickly enough. We had been calling for earlier and faster moves earlier on. They didn't happen, which has sort of set up this pathway of those pressures remaining stickier for longer. The question is, again, whether or not any change at this late piece would necessarily happen. But you do have that sort of wild discoordination at the moment coming through from various parts. The markets had been pricing in large amounts of cuts and have now just shuffled back a bit, but are still picking some pretty aggressive shifts. Like the Reserve Bank said previously, they thought they were about hiking next time, and they might well be still considering that. But looking through the numbers, you've also had some of the retail banks that are starting to cut back their interest rates because actual lending rates for them, some of those wholesale swap rates and similar, have come back as well. So there's a lot of moving parts, sort of perhaps that is indicative that we're towards the top of the cycle and it's a bit hard to figure out where to next. But again, how you calibrate that and what that means for the future is going to be quite important. We'll assess where all of those things go next, including the unemployment rate and what the Reserve Bank thinks about all of this and what they most importantly do with interest rates on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.